Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Big Easy Sports Talk podcast. I'm your host, Nick Garisco, and I'm here with Michael Pelichan in today's local podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing what expectations we should have for the Pelicans this season. Should we be buying the local hype? We have several storylines from the Pelicans Summer League. We have Zion's knee injury, Jackson Hayes' incredible dunks, and some solid performances from Nickeil Alexander-Walker and an LSU player. What does it all mean? Michael is going to give us some necessary Pelicans guidance here today. But before we talk about those subjects, let's talk about what I think is the biggest news lately in Pelicans. And I can't believe we haven't discussed this yet, Michael. And that is the two massive free agent additions with Derek Favors and J.J. Redick. They are now New Orleans Pelicans. I can't even believe it. Michael, what are your thoughts on Derek Favors first?
I'm really excited. So I had Ben Dowsett come on, I think about a week ago, and talk about Favors' game. Ben has actually covered him during his time in Utah. And so Favors is a center. I'm excited to see him play his natural position, because if you look at anything statistically with when Favors was playing alongside Rudy Gobert, or when he wasn't, he was a radically different player. And the reason for that is because Favors is such a good center, and Gobert is such a good center, and their games, just despite the fact that they're both very good, didn't really complement one another. So they had him taking threes. He wasn't very good at it. He wasn't getting as many rolls to the rim because it was more cluttered in there, and because Gobert is a really good rim runner. So I'm excited to see what he'll do in a full-time starting five position. They acquired him for basically no cost. I mean, giving up second-rounders is really nothing at all. Second-rounders, to me, I'm not going to say that they can never pan out, because that's certainly not true, but you're really, really taking a shot in the dark when you're taking second-rounders, and I just don't value them that much. So to get a starting caliber center like that, and someone who really fits with running up and down the floor, the style that they want to implement here, I think it makes a lot of sense, and I'm really excited to see what he has to offer here.
Is this something that kind of pigeonholes Zion Williamson into the power forward position? How does it really affect Zion here? Is he now more of the set four for us?
He is for now. I don't think it'll necessarily pigeonhole him for the future. I think one of the main things that they were looking to do this year is sort of give him an easier transition than some NBA rookies enjoy, because typically, especially at the top of the draft, you have some pretty bad teams. So sometimes these guys will come in, they have these incredible expectations on them, and Zion certainly would have that if they were not managed. And so I think what they're trying to do, the Pelicans that is they're trying to figure out a way to put him in positions to succeed and to not have all of this weight on his own shoulders. And so I don't think that getting Favors, especially since he just has 1 year left on his deal right now, I don't think that interferes with that long term. So no, I don't think so.
Is Favors going to be a one and done, kind of like Julius Randle was when we signed him here? Or do you think that the Pelicans may be kind of auditioning him for the future to play with Zion? I know that's kind of a complicated question, because we just don't really know how Favors is going to fare in year one. But with Jackson Hayes, kind of our center that we just drafted, kind of waiting in the wings, is this kind of a 1 year rental for Favors? Is that fair to say? Or do you think that there's a longer future here possibly?
So if we're going according to what Griffin says that he sees him as part of the nucleus moving forward.
Wow.
I don't know. Well, yeah, I mean, it's quite a comment. And Griffin, by the way, I want to take a small second to say that guy publicly is so good at what he does. It's so really right. Great. I wrote an article like 2 days ago talking. It was actually a thank you letter to him. It was like getting really dangerously close to talking about feelings, but I'm so grateful for the way that he's managed everything, and it's been really great.
He's been nothing short of candid, which is actually kind of rare in today's sporting world. Honestly, a lot of coaches and GMs are trying to be so secretive now because of the competitive advantage that they perceive. And a lot of coaches don't like to reveal anything about players' injuries or strategies going forward, because they feel like they're getting a leg up on their opponent, and some of them just don't like being bothered by the media. But David Griffin has shown such a mature and really awesome approach to handling media questions and to giving a great direction for the franchise. I mean, I have nothing but compliments to say about David Griffin. That seems like a heck of a hire so far, and I know it's very early, but I have no problem with you taking a second to compliment Griffin because, wow, I mean, this guy seems like the real deal so far.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so what he was saying about Favors before I brought us off topic was that basically Favors is someone that he sees as part of the nucleus. I don't necessarily think that that's set in stone. I think ultimately what they're trying to do here, and they have so many young prospects, is I think they're trying to see what works and what doesn't. So I think all of it really truly is subject to change besides Zion, honestly. I think ultimately, I'm not saying that all these players on the trade block, but I think all of this is meant, in my mind, to bring out the best in Zion. Griffin has also spoken very, very highly of Jrue Holiday, so there's a possibility that if he does believe that Jrue Holiday is going to be an MVP candidate type of player, then certainly if you have an MVP candidate on your team, then he's part of the future as well. But I do think that most of this relates to Zion and bring out the best in him. So in that way, if Favors works really well with him, then great. If not, I think just like anybody else, I mean, if Zion truly is the centerpiece of this franchise moving forward, which he appears to be, then I think it's all subject to change. But with that in mind, I do think that we're going to see really, really good things this year from Favors. I think he's primed for a breakout season.
Yeah, he has been kind of overshadowed, I would say, by Rudy Gobert, and not just by Rudy Gobert, who's one of the best traditional centers in the NBA, but he's also overshadowed because he plays for the Utah Jazz. I mean, let's be honest here. I mean, they are a team that a lot of people don't really get to watch because they're in that awkward time zone with Denver. I think there's only 2 teams in that time zone, and they have oddly scheduled time games. And the Jazz are just not a team that kind of get people jazzed up, pun intended there. But Favors has kind of really gone under the radar in the last couple of years for those 2 reasons. And I'm kind of excited to see what he can do, like you're saying, in his natural position. Hopefully, you're right, and he'll have a breakout year. Let's get to the other guy here. And if you don't know a lot about Derek Favors, you probably know a lot about J.J. Redick because, the former Duke Blue Devils, one of the best Duke college players of all time, honestly. And that's saying a lot, obviously, coming from Duke. He's had a very long and successful NBA career. He was a sixth man for a long time. And actually, I think pretty much throughout his whole career, but he's kind of a late bloomer, right, Michael? I mean, just the last couple of years, J.J. Redick has really, taken form and really kind of found his shot in the NBA. What are your thoughts on Redick with the Pelicans?
So yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see what kind of role he has. You alluded to the fact that he was a sixth man. He was for the vast majority of the beginning of his career. About 4 or 5 years ago, actually looks like 6 years ago, he started starting. But I do think that he is someone, I mean, it's very clear what he gives you. People talk about shooting a lot, and I think this is a really, really great person to illustrate what real shooting is. J.J. Redick runs off so many screens at such a consistent high speed for him, of course, because he's not extremely fast or anything like that, but he's someone who comes off screens so well, and a lot of the times when he's shooting, he's not even facing the goal when he's starting to shoot. And what that does for you is it means that he's already getting in his shooting motion before the defender even gets around the screen. So the ability to block and to contest that is radically different. And you add in the fact that he's converting at a 40% plus rate, which he has been for most of his seasons recently. His lowest season in the last 6 years is 39.5% from 3. And that's at a solid volume as well. So, I mean, this guy is truly an incredible shooter and impacts your spacing in a way that someone who just catches off of a drive and shoots does not. So they're going to need it this year, and I think it was an excellent veteran signing. I think it's exactly what you need. You're not overpaying for him in the sense of, you're handing out a crazy contract. It's a 2-year contract, about $13 million per. That's not that bad, and for what he's going to give you in the locker room and on the court, I think it's just a perfect fit.
I loved the signing, obviously, and that's not just because I'm a Duke fan. I thought it was exactly what the Pelicans needed. I really wanted an extra three-point shooter to be kind of that guy who can shoot from range, just because, Jrue can do it, but he doesn't excel at a long-distance shot, I would say. You might disagree there, but I think that and Lonzo Ball obviously doesn't have that long-range shot yet. Zion Williamson, it just depends on how that's going to progress. I don't really know, Favors is shooting many threes, but basically, I just think we really needed a three-point shooter, and Redick really fits the bill. The knock on Redick, though, seems to be, at least based on what I've seen, seems to be his defense. And do you think he's a liability on defense, Michael? And if he is, how do players go about scheming around that?
So I think one of the reasons that it's not as big of an issue for us is that we actually have a lot of versatility. If Lonzo and Drew are playing alongside Redick, you have a lot of versatility that you typically wouldn't have in most guard lineups, because both of those guys, so Drew is 6'4", really, really strong, has shown consistently that he's one of the best switching perimeter defenders in the NBA. He's a phenomenal post defender for his position. It's really kind of incredible. And so Lonzo isn't necessarily holding up in the post the way that Drew is, but Lonzo is 6'6", really quick feet, quick hands, a solid positional understanding, probably gambles a little bit too much, but you have a lot of perimeter flexibility there. So in reality, what you're going to be doing with Redick, if he's playing alongside those guys, is you're actually going to be putting Redick on the weakest player. So is that a perfect solution? Is it something that he's making your defense consistently better? I wouldn't necessarily say that's the case, because you can't really switch onto big guys and you have to sort of avoid those situations. But I think it's mitigated by the presence of so many good, long, athletic perimeter defenders, and not to mention our bigs. Our team is very athletic, and I think that you're right to highlight how bad the shooting is. The shooting is poor. I just did a statistical projection of how many threes they're going to make. It wasn't very many. But what I do think they will be is I think they'll be an incredibly athletic team. Probably not a top defense because they're not old enough, but they'll be getting out in transition a whole lot, and they'll be scoring a lot of points in transition, and they'll have a very good defense. I don't think it'll be quite elite, but I think all of those things speak to, again, like what you're saying, Redick is bringing something very, very unique for this team. And in that way, he has an extremely valuable role for us because we just don't have a lot of it elsewhere. So I think you live with the defensive deficiencies that he presents to the situation. And he's been in the league long enough to where, although he is small, although he's not a great athlete, he's at least has a solid positional understanding of what he should be doing. Right. And you can hide him on the worst perimeter offensive player, basically.
Yeah, he's a smart player, and he certainly seems like an upgrade offensively over guys like Darius Miller and Etuan Moore, for example. These two signings are big, and it's not just because the players are good, but it also kind of speaks to the message, maybe, or the future of the Pelicans. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people thought that the Pelicans were, after they drafted Zion Williamson, were going to have a slow rebuild process. And maybe we still are. But the signing of Derek Favors and the signing of J.J. Redick kind of allude to the idea that the Pelicans may be in more win-now mode than people realize. And I shouldn't say win-now mode because that's a bad term because everybody's trying to win now, but I think the audience, and you kind of know what I mean there, the Pelicans seemed a little more aggressive in free agency than I expected them to be, and especially because Favors is on such a short deal, and I believe Redick's on a 2-year deal. So I'm a little surprised that the Pelicans are I love the signings, but I was a little surprised with how aggressive the Pelicans were in terms of I shouldn't call them short-term solutions, but I think you kind of get the gist of what I'm saying here. And it begs the question, Michael, because people are talking. Are the Pelicans actually a playoff contender now that we have Derek Favors, now that we have J.J. Redick, Brandon Ingram, Lonzo Ball, Drew Holiday, Zion Williamson? That is a very talented roster, and like you mentioned, very athletic roster. And we're young, but we do have some veteran presence with Redick and Drew. It seems like a team that can actually win a fair amount of games, even in the Western Conference. So, excuse me for buying into the hype, but I really want to get your impression on whether you think the Pelicans can be a playoff team in that brutal Western Conference.
I think they can, and one thing that I really like is there are a lot of really good statisticians out there that are doing these kind of projections for where it's going to shake out in terms of wins. There's a guy named Jacob Goldstein. I think that's how you pronounce his last name, Jacob. Forgive me. I know you're not listening, but if I got your name wrong. But the guy does really, really sharp analysis, and he actually has the Pelicans at 45 wins. I think this is a playoff caliber team. Whether they make it, I don't know. But I do think that this is the team. They're just so deep. Zach Lowe was even saying it in one of his recent articles or podcasts that this is a team that rolls out so many people in a way that most teams can't match. And that gives you such an advantage in the regular season where you're having, a couple injuries here and there. I think the rationale so we traded for Favors and we signed Redick, right? And I think the rationale for that was that they wanted to find players who would help us to win now. So we are, in a sense, trying to win now. But I think they're trying to win now in a way that still we didn't have to give up any assets really to get them. No long-term assets, no long-term deal. And at the same time, they're not sacrificing any flexibility moving forward because they're not long-term. So I think it was a nexus of all of those things. And that was, to me, what they were trying to accomplish with these signings. And I think they did exactly that. And so I'm excited about it. And I do think this is a playoff caliber team.
So Favors was actually a trade, and I apologize to the audience here. I kept saying that we signed him, but we added him. And Redick was a free agent signing. And kind of to my point that I'm saying here, and to your point that we are a potential playoff caliber team, you can't really sell a guy like J.J. Redick to come to New Orleans on a 2-year deal unless you're convincing him, in my opinion at least, that we're competing right now. You know what I'm saying, Michael? Like J.J. Redick is in the second half of his career. He's a savvy vet. He could go. Every team needs a guy like J.J. Redick who could be just their go-to long-distance shooter. And he had his choice. I mean, he could have taken a short deal to a team like the Lakers or whatever if he wanted a ring chase. But he chose the Pelicans, and it wasn't like a gaudy contract. So it just leads me to believe that Redick honestly either believes or was told that, we're going for the playoffs right now. Like, we want to complete right now in the next 2 years, so come play with us. What are your thoughts on that? Do you agree?
I do. No, I think that you're right. So I think that Redick isn't going to go on a team that isn't going to compete to some extent. Maybe you could have argued that for a gross overpay, you could have gotten him on a bad team. Yeah. He's agreed to some. Yeah, I mean, so I think that is possible, but I do think that you're correct in that the sense that he chose this team for a reason, and I think what we offered him were a few things, right? So we offered him a nice contract for 2 years. I think we offered him an opportunity to mentor younger players and to be part of a sort of a revitalized culture. And I think I don't know if I said this already, but we're giving him playing time too. Like, he has a very, very clearly defined role in this team, and I think that was probably told to him by Griffin right off the bat. So in that way, I think because of all those things, I think he sees this as a great opportunity. And look, it's a really weird thing for me right now because I try to be very balanced in my analysis, but everything that I'm seeing from the Pelicans is so good and is so universally lauded that I'm having a hard time picking things to criticize. Like, I don't. It really is unique. I've never been in this position before, and now that I'm older, and
not with the Pelicans.
No, I in the past when I was younger, I was sort of a cockeyed optimist, and I think that showed in my analysis. And then over watching the Pelicans, kind of fumble a lot of things, I realized like that's not the case. Things always don't work out, but even with that sort of experience, things are just good.
This is a team that everybody is talking about being on the rise. It's not just local hype about the New Orleans Pelicans. All the NBA analysts are talking about the Pelicans being one of these teams that have a great future. And just think, the crazy thing to me, Michael, is I don't want to just relish in all this for too long, but the crazy thing to me is that just 3 months ago, when we didn't have that number 1 overall pick, and we didn't have David Griffin, and we didn't have Aaron Nelson, and J.J. Redick, Brandon Ingram, Lonzo Ball, and we just had a disgruntled star, basically. That's all we had. That was our asset, along with Drew. And we were talking about on this very podcast that this was going to be a 3 to 5 year rebuild. That was 3 months ago. And all the things that have happened in the last 3 months, the amount of change that this organization has undergone in great change is unbelievable. And we have every reason to be optimistic, because I just never could have imagined that we would go from one of the I don't want to say worst, but one of the franchises that had the least amount of near future hope, right? Like short-sighted hope, like winning in the next 2 years. And now it's a realistic possibility. We're talking about making the playoffs in the Western Conference, 3 months after, we were kind of, totally out of it, right? So it's really exciting. And I want to, I have to say, I really didn't consider the Pelicans a playoff team, even with Zion and all that stuff we just saw, until we got Favors and Redick. And I think that's really going to push us right on that fringe of the Western Conference. And that's fun, though. I mean, that's awesome. In year one of Zion Williamson, year one of Lonzo and Ingram being on the team, I mean, that's awesome. I would be pumped to make the playoffs even as the 8th seed in what is probably the toughest conference maybe in NBA history, arguably. But there are a lot of great teams in the West, right? I mean, it's tough to pick out which teams – we're certainly talented, but it's tough to pick out which teams aren't going to make it.
Yeah, it's sort of a unique time, and I think the fact that the West is, or the title is wide open in a way that it hasn't been really since the Warriors formed their super team. So I think in that way, teams they realize their opportunity, and it might not be a long one, especially since Kawhi and Paul George just combined up for the Clippers. But
but that was so great that he did not go to the Lakers, though. I mean, that really changed the complexion of the NBA. I don't want to get too off topic here, but honestly, that was so huge for the National Basketball Association, because that changed the dynamic for the next couple of years. I know Kawhi probably wouldn't have gone to the Clippers without Paul George, and he might end up becoming a Laker, but I really think Kawhi that's just great stories, though. I mean, now they got Anthony Davis and LeBron in Los Angeles, crosstown rivals or actually same town rivals with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. So they got that rivalry, and it just really opens up the entire West and makes up for great storylines. And then we have Brooklyn in 2 years coming, and it's just awesome. Right now, it's just a great time to be the NBA fan. And I'm an NFL guy, as you know, and I'm getting more and more hooked on the NBA just because of all this competitive balance that the league has shown.
Yeah, I agree. And I wanted to talk about one thing, too, because I wanted to talk about Darius Miller, a guy. It's sort of a signing that I think people have misunderstood. When it came out that he was going to be signed for 2 years and basically $14 million, everybody was thinking like he doesn't seem to be worth that. And I'm not saying that as a slant against Miller, because Miller is a good player. But I think that from what I see, and to be candid, it looks like to me, when you have that non-guaranteed money and you have an overpay, what it looks like is salary that can be aggregated in a trade later. So under certain rules, right? So you have to if you're an over-the-cap team, then what you can acquire in a trade has to be in a certain range salary-wise with what you send out. So it's hard to piece together a deal if you're going to send someone that the other team doesn't want. But what you can send is you can send salary that comes off the books at the end of the year. And Darius Miller is a guy who he actually went to Europe after he played for us and then came back and played for us again. Consummate pro, awesome guy, someone who was actually on Davis's championship team, great three-point shooter at this point. I should take it down a notch. Very good three-point shooter at this point.
Right.
But he's not worth his contract, and I think that the overpay was done specifically to, one, reward him for his years of service, and then two, provide an opportunity. Well, I should say, one, to provide an opportunity to trade him as part of a larger package if that becomes available, and then two, in the process, you're rewarding a guy who's given really solid effort for a couple of years and who actually provides some sort of thing that you need this year, which is shooting. So right. I wanted to talk about that. Yeah,
because I did forget to mention him. 2 years, $14 million on the surface. When you just read that, sounds like a lot for a role player like Darius Miller, but it does. His signing does kind of even add to the Pelicans' depth. I mean, it kind of speaks to how much depth we really have. And, if the last year of the contract isn't guaranteed, it's really just like a 1-year, $7 million contract,
Exactly.
which sounds much more manageable and affordable here. So let's move on to – sorry.
I would say
Sure.
one more thing, because I think
ahead.
that you nailed it. I think you need to look at it as a 1-year contract, but what's nice about it is because it's non-guaranteed, really it's whatever years that you want. So, I mean, not just only is it a 1-year deal, but what if they have someone next season that they want to get in a trade and the salary's there again, right? So then it's expiring. You have the option to make it expiring whenever you want it to. So I think that's really awesome flexibility, and I think you nailed it. You have to look at it as a 1-year deal with the possibility of being another 1-year deal, right? And I think that flexibility is awesome.
Yeah, just another move that Michael here is complimenting by David Griffin, of course. We have to move on to the Summer League because there's actually – I know the Summer League doesn't really seem that important. Usually it isn't. But this year it might prove to be an exception because there's a lot of storylines that are happening right now, and we're going to touch on each of them kind of in bullet point or quick fashion here. The first storyline, obviously, is Zion's knee injury. In this first summer game, I think he had, 10 points or something like that, and he had a bone bruise in his left knee. And the Pelicans are reportedly shutting him down for the rest of the summer league. That sounds like a harsh headline. What do you make of that, Michael? And is there any cause for concern?
No, I think that it would be easy without really taking a step back and looking at what's happened with Zion the last few months to look at his conditioning and to say, oh, well, this could be a concern. He won't be in shape moving forward. I think that's a little ridiculous, and that was a question. That was actually something that was being thrown out nationally at Zion is he in shape to play? Will he always be out of shape? Is he Big Baby 2.0, et cetera? I think if you look at this, and the Pelicans have said as much, Zion has been on a roadshow for a few months now. So Zion, gets drafted number 1. He's negotiating his shoe deal. He's kind of everywhere. So, I mean, he's someone who
he has to meet several
on.
teams. He's got to meet because the lottery, they don't know who's going to get the first overall pick. So he's got to meet with several teams and probably had several visits to fly and talk to several teams. And he's just becoming professional. So he's traveling all over the place, and that's actually very common in the NFL too, where all these rookies are coming in are flying often. And they lose a little bit track of their workout and their diet because they have to eat fast food now because they're on the road often. It happens to anybody who's in that situation. And sometimes it takes them a full training camp, if you will, or a full summer in this case, to get truly back into basketball shape.
Well, I guess the one thing, I'm not sure if he was actually meeting with other teams. I don't know. I think he wasn't, probably because it was clear at that point once the lottery happened that the Pelicans would get him. But he's certainly, like you're saying, I don't think he's going to be in shape until probably close to training camp. And I think, if anything, what I saw from Zion in the game that he played was that Zion at the beginning looked very, very much like he was forcing it. Someone who was sort of adapting to the NBA game. And then as the game progressed, he found his spots to impact the game. And it was very clear just how physically dominant he was when he snatched the ball from Knox and dunked. And just in general, oh, man, it was great. I mean, and again, I didn't see anything in that game that contradicted what we thought Zion was, nor did I see anything that said, oh, this guy's even better than we thought he would be. And like you said, it's Summer League. It's something that, to be frank to listeners who do not know a lot about Summer League is very often trash basketball. It's just not high-quality basketball. These guys they're not getting a whole lot of practices. A lot of them are coming in through trades that happen on July 6th, which is after Summer League started. So, I mean, this is a league where it really is glorified pickup basketball with the best of college and some internationals and a couple of, G League, not a couple of G Leaguers, but G Leaguers and guys who are in maybe their second year in the NBA and haven't proved themselves. So it's not high quality basketball. And I think that anything that you see in those games, you should be not conclusive about. And so that would be what I would say about Summer League.
Well, one thing that I am conclusive about, and we can't really, if we're going to take Summer League performances with a grain of salt, that's fine. But one thing that was very conclusive and clear was Jackson Hayes' athleticism, right? Because his dunks in those games were unreal, honestly. What were your impressions of Hayes? I saw you tweeting a lot about him when it was happening, and giving our boy Mavs draft, Richard Stamen, who came on here this podcast twice as a great guest, who kind of maybe not introduced us to Hayes, but kind of went out on a limb when he said Hayes is going to be one of the best players from this draft class, and that was prior to when we picked him at pick 8. So I saw you giving Richard Stamen props, and he deserves it, of course. But let's talk about Jackson Hayes a little. What were your thoughts after seeing those monstrous dunks? And
it confirmed all that I thought he was as an athlete, and gave me more, I guess. Man, I didn't realize, that when I saw his windmill dunk after we drafted him, he did a windmill dunk from the free throw line. I was thinking, right, holy crap, there aren't a lot of guys who can do that, much less guys who are 6'11". Honestly, probably in the mold of a JaVale or a DeAndre in terms of their raw athleticism, just not something you see very often. When I saw his performance in Summer League, on the first, I think it was the second play or third play, he had a pass from Nickeil Alexander-Walker that just came in so hot. And it bounced off his hands for a second, but very quickly he gathered it again and scored. And that's something to where having good hands with that athleticism and being able to get up and down the floor and then to get up above the rim like that, I mean, in terms of an athletic package, I really was just blown away. I do have other questions about him, and I think that, again, this is not conclusive. This is Summer League, but there's some habits that I noticed that aren't as productive. So, as an example, one, we already knew he wasn't that big, and that's something that'll come with time, I think. So I'm not worried about that yet. But one thing I do think if he is going to add more to his game, he was releasing the ball very low on his shots, and there's not really a lot of good that comes from having length on offense and finishing over people if you're diminishing your length by, releasing it while you're hunched over and whatever. I'm not worried about that, but I do think it sort of gives you a picture of what is he right now. He's a freak athlete who runs up and down the floor, has a great motor, someone who could become, if he develops his frame, just an absolute force athletically. But at this moment, he's not a lot more than that, and that's okay. But I think that should caution, or we should at least curb our expectations about him being the next Shaquille O'Neal until we see additional things as well.
Right, and that release point actually is a big deal. It doesn't sound like much, but when the analogy here is a lot of fans and teams want their quarterbacks to be tall, right? So they can have a very high release point, so it's more difficult to deflect their passes. But if you have a guy who's 6'6" or 6'7", like your Brock Osweiler types, if his release is at his shoulder, not quite Phillip Rivers style, but if his release is at his shoulder, then that kind of negates what the purpose of his height is doing for him. So, one of the great things about Drew Brees is that, he's short. I mean, I think he's under 6 foot. He's listed at 6 foot, but he's probably more like 5'10", 5'11", but he stands on his tiptoes and he releases that ball at the highest possible point. So he comes across like he's actually throwing a 6'2" or 6'3" quarterback. Whereas, Brock Osweiler, one of the reasons that he gets so many passes deflected is because he's 6'7", but he's releasing it so low that he's not taking advantage of his height. So that's kind of that's kind of the analogy there for Jackson Hayes. You got to keep the ball up high and use his 6'11" frame to his advantage. And honestly, I can't wait until he maxes out that frame and he gets in that NBA locker room and starts really pumping some iron, especially in his upper body there, because he could really be a monster if he gets a thicker frame on there. You mentioned Nickeil Alexander-Walker. He was throwing some hard passes, but he also was throwing some good passes. What were your impression of some of his assists?
My first impression of him was on the first play. So he was someone where I really didn't know fully what to expect. And on his first play, he threw this just really, I mean, I don't know another word for it. I apologize for the listeners, but just a ballsy pass. I was like, who is this guy? Like, who does he think he is throwing this pass? And his first, he barely had any practice, and I think he was just trying to get the ball to Hayes. But I was thinking, well, okay, this guy's a risk taker. And then throughout the game, it really stood out to me how good of a feel he has for where to find people, the timing of how to find them. He's always throwing off live dribbles, so he's a guy who's, despite the fact that he shoots right-handed, he's doing the majority of the other things with his left hand. So he'll dribble left, and he'll like kind of just sling these passes to people. It's a good thing. So I think the fact that I think he's a very good feel for the game. He showed some defensive chops. He defended, I'm blanking on his name right now, but the guy from Chicago, Kobe White. Kobe White is his name. Very well throughout the game, and I think Kobe White's going to be a good NBA player. I think that his shot, I'm not as sure about yet. Richard actually pointed to some sort of issues that he has because he shoots to the side of his head, and that will kind of affect how closeouts from the right side will affect him. But I think overall, I was just really impressed with his feel for the game. The question for me is this, right? So this is the problem with Summer League, is that Nickeil Alexander-Walker right now is in a primary facilitating role. Is he going to be that for the Pelicans next year? Absolutely not. There's no way that they're going to put the ball in his hands that much next year. At least to my estimation, I don't think that's going to happen. So you're evaluating a player in a role that he won't actually assume next year. Will he assume that 4 or 5 years from now? Maybe. And in that role, I thought he showed a lot of promise. But I think that's why you take these things with a grain of salt, because they're playing against worse defenses and roles that they might not even assume. So I think that's where you should have questions.
In a game against the Knicks, I believe it was our first Summer League game, Frank Jackson, I mean, he was lighting it up. I think he had over 30 points in that game. And the game was cut short by one of the California earthquakes. Did you end up having a very, very favorable impression of Frank Jackson, or were a lot of his points that he got, kind of pickup fashion?
This is where I will probably disagree most with a lot of the other writers that I was seeing talk about it. Not all of them, because I can't consolidate everybody's opinion into one. But I think people were really impressed by Frank Jackson's performance. I was actually not. So, one, Frank Jackson was, again, he was dominant. And once he figured out I guess whatever sort of hiccups he had early on in the game, I mean, he was just lighting it up. But I don't really take that much from it, because he just looks so uncomfortable in a primary distributing role. And the problem with that is that Frank Jackson's sort of a combo guard in his size. He's really not a point guard. Well, actually, he's a point guard in his size, but more of a combo guard in his mentality. And that sort of puts a ceiling on what you can expect from him. He's someone who I've always liked a whole lot as an actual person. He seems to be a great person, as most of the Pelicans do. It's really quite amazing, honestly. But I do think that I have serious questions about what kind of role or what his ceiling would be if he can't assume a primary guard role to initiate the offense, and if he's not big enough to really be a secondary kind of guy, like a two. So in that way, I think he might cap out as a sort of role player. And I don't think that's an insult. I just think you should temper what you see with him until you see him become that good of a shooter. That, to me, is where the line's drawn. Is
he our backup point guard right now? Is that fair to say?
I don't know. I think they're going to do a lot of playmaking by committee. So in that way, I don't necessarily think they'll need a backup point guard. I think that they have a lot of players who are able to handle the ball. So Lonzo, Zion as a big, Brandon Ingram to some extent, depending on how much Alexander Walker's going to play. But I think with the collective playmaking that they have, I don't necessarily think they'll need a de facto point guard on the bench. But I think it's a fair question to be raised, and it's really going to depend on who starts and who doesn't. And Redick actually is probably also someone that I should mention. It's not like Redick's not slinging these amazing passes during the game, but Redick knows how to find an open man, knows his role within the offense. So I think they have it collectively, but I think it's a fair question to ask.
I raised the question because Lonzo Ball has not proven that he can stay healthy in the NBA yet, right? We've had 2 injury-plagued seasons so far, and I kind of think that Frank Jackson would get, maybe it would be kind of a point guard by committee, but I kind of believe that Frank Jackson would get first dibs at that. he would have the first shot at seeing what he could do there. So it does kind of worry me that when you say that he's not a good distributor yet, and he's more of just kind of a scorer, if you will. But I guess that remains to be seen. And like you said, I guess they'll try to make a committee out of it. But my impression is that if Lonzo Ball were to get hurt, that our first option would probably be to try Frank Jackson as our point guard. And I'm getting a little concerned. I was getting happy after seeing the box score, but now I'm getting a little concerned. But that's good. I mean, that's nuanced analysis. Not every point that is scored in the box score is equal in terms of actually how it's scored and how it's affecting the basketball game. So that's interesting that I didn't know I was raising a controversial point when I asked that question about were you impressed with Jackson. But I like your answer though, because I don't want a yes man here. So that's good.
Yeah.
Michael,
I want to say something good about him too, because I don't want to say like that Frank Jackson isn't going to be a good player. And like you're saying, it could be a committee approach. I think it's just more of long-term projection of what he could be. I certainly think he could be a role player, but all these visions of him being an elite scorer at this moment seem to be unfounded. And I think they will heavily depend on how great of a pull-up shooter he could become if he wanted to start in the NBA. So,
Big B Williams, the LSU product, and Didi Silva are kind of making names for themselves in the Summer League. What are your thoughts on them? And do you think any of them stick?
Okay, so this is going to be a hard one because I think people are really excited about Cavell Bigby Williams, and I don't think that's necessarily in a way that's completely irrational. He's a guy who's 6'11", he runs the floor well, he works really hard, he can get up. He had a really awesome alley-oop that he completed from, I can't remember who passed it. It probably was Alexander Walker. I can't remember who it was, but it was way above the rim. But I think where I would be skeptical here is there are just so many good run and jump bigs in the NBA that I'm just not that impressed by it anymore. The fact that you can run the floor and dunk, to me, now Jackson Hayes is so elite at it that he stands out. But I don't think Cavell Bigby Williams is at that level. And in that way, I have questions about what he could become. I haven't seen enough to make a really definitive declaration on him, but my general opinion about bigs is that if you give them enough minutes, ones that are decent enough rebounders and decent enough run and jump guys are going to get you a double-double. So the fact that they're producing double-doubles doesn't really impress me unless they're impacting the game outside of that. I haven't seen enough to really get excited about him outside of that, and I think we have enough big guys that I can't really see him having a permanent fixture on this roster yet. Maybe you get a two-way deal out of him, but that's my general sort of impression of him so far.
So his numbers and his dunks were more flash and less substance there, less actionable, transferable skills that could actually be applied to the NBA game.
Kind of. I'd say that they are transferable, but he hasn't stood out enough to make them the sole way that he eats, so to speak. Like, I guess you have to have a skill to in the NBA if you want to make it, especially as a big. There are a lot of run and jump bigs who are just as good. I mean, you can even look at like the Plumlees. I mean, the Plumlees are really, really good run and jump athletes. There's so many that are good at it that if you want to stand out and you're not going to be a great post scorer or anything like that, or a great distributor. I've actually heard that he was a really good passer at LSU. I didn't watch a lot of LSU, so I don't know. But you have to have some sort of other marketable skill unless you're so good at it that you rise above everybody else. And Jackson Hayes is that good at it, and that's why when you played, I mean, people were just like, holy crap, this guy's going to score like almost 30 points on just dunks. I mean, that was how crazy it was. And
well, he literally rises above everybody else.
Yes, exactly. So, like, that to me is where you say, okay, well, this guy's not just good at it, he's elite at it. And that to me stands out. And then you say this guy could probably find a role in the NBA versus Bigby Williams, where I'm not saying that he can't, but he's not good enough at that thing to make it his only skill. He has to find something else. And that's where my skepticism would sort of creep in.
And what about Didi Silva?
So I was very impressed with. I think what really stood out to me, and I think he's played professionally before, correct me if I'm wrong, or someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what stood out to me was really how, I guess he just looked mature. Like it wasn't that he was doing these extravagant things. And so we're actually recording this during one of their games. So I'm going to have to go back and watch his second game. But his first game, what stood out to me was that he made a lot of the decisions that are just simple, right decisions. And he looked to be a really solid NBA body, athletic, someone who can pull up from three really, really easily. That was sort of his reputation that I had heard before. So I guess that's where I see someone who could become a really solid player. And what's really nice about him is that we're stashing him in Australia for a year as he learns English, as he sort of builds his game up and before he comes to the NBA. So we could be getting him a year from now, and he could be really good, and we'd still be getting him like at a similar price tag. So I'm excited about it. I think he's going to be good. I think Griffin nailed these picks, man. Again, I have a hard time being this optimistic because it's so good that I have nothing bad to say at this moment. But it just looks good, man. I think he nailed it.
Well, things can change quickly. Once you watch tonight's game, you never know what's really going to happen. But like you said, Summer League is all just, glorified pickup. And right now it's just about the players going through the motions. But we'll continue to watch and we'll continue to make judgments, however good they may be. But either way, that's going to wrap up this week's local episode. But hey, thank you so much for listening. And if you like what you heard today, please give us a great rating on iTunes. And you can find us on all social media at Best Podcast NOLA. And our personal Twitter handles now. Mike is at Mike Pelicans. And
Mike _ Pelicans, Nick. You trying to scream for the wrong
Pelicans.
Thing? There we go. Yeah.
And I am Fantasy Law Guy. No underscores there. And we'll be back next week. Tell all your friends, who dat, and let's dance.